Welcome everyone to Save the Sounds Environmental Film Club. This is the 5th installation of our film club. So we're so happy to have you all with us. My name is Anthony Allen. I'm the Ecological Communications Specialist here at Save the Sound. And we have a phenomenal group of people with us today, panelists included, to talk about the film Fools and Dreamers, Regenerating a Native Forest. This is a Happen Films film, and it's really a pretty incredible story that we're really excited to sort of break down and dig into with the group that we have with us today. So that group is Alicia Sullivan, who is our Chief Development Officer at Save the Sound. Alicia was also, before joining Save the Sound, was also the Connecticut Director of the Trust for Public Land. So bringing that deep conservation background into the room today. We also have Louise Harrison, who is our New York Natural Areas Coordinator. Louise is our office out on Long Island. And she's a beloved member of our team and has a wide range, as you'll see, I'm sure, during the conversation, a wide range of experience and background in restoration and conservation. And finally, we have our special guest today, Caro Scanlan, who is the GreenSkills Manager for the Urban Resources Initiative here in New Haven. So that is our panel. And for those of you who are not completely familiar with Save the Sound, we are a nonprofit organization that leads environmental action across the Long Island Sound region. We do that by fighting climate change, by protecting Long Island Sound and its rivers, by working with nature through ecological restoration to restore ecosystems to health and abundance, and by protecting and preserving endangered or threatened lands. And like so many other nonprofits and so many businesses, honestly, at this time, and individuals, we have not been immune to the coronavirus pandemic and the effects of the uncertainty and everything that's happening right now. So if you have the capacity to help us out and support our work, we'd be very, very grateful. You can go to www.savethesound.org/donate to make that happen. And we are very appreciative of everyone's support. So without further ado, let's dive in. Fools and Dreamers. I'm going to go to Caro first on this to bring you into the room. I think if you can tell us just a little bit about URI, the Urban Resource Initiative, and then also help us to level set for this conversation. So there was a lot of themes and a lot of techniques and things that we saw happen in this film. So if you can just level set for us, what do we mean when we talk about forest regeneration or forest succession, and why is that important? Why are trees important? Why should we be caring about this and this kind of effort?
Sure. Thanks, Anthony, for letting me start us off. So first, I will share a little bit about Urban Resources Initiative. We are a nonprofit based here in New Haven, Connecticut, and we're affiliated with the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And our mission is to foster community-based forestry and land stewardship here in the city of New Haven. And we do that with a few different programs. Our street tree planting program, which I run, is a resident-based, request system where anyone who lives in New Haven can request to have a street tree planted by our team, and they commit to being that tree steward and watering it for the first 3 years while it establishes. And we also have groups that work with neighborhood volunteers to do volunteer-based restoration programs in natural areas and vacant lots and streetscapes. And we have a bioswale installation team as well. So those are the 3 major sort of program areas of Urban Resources Initiative, or URI. I try not to say that when I'm too close to Rhode Island, but that's the acronym that we use. And we're deeply engaged in restoration work here in New Haven, but I'm primarily working in the streetscape. But I wanted to Yeah, to level the conversation, I guess, or to think about forests and forest succession more broadly. I mean, when we were talking as a group of panelists yesterday, we were thinking about some of the parallels between the ecosystem that we were looking at in the film, this old pasture land that had been grazed for quite some time, being restored to native forest. And, you know, I couldn't help but think about our own history in New England and in southern New England, and thinking about this land that just wants to be forest. If you leave it alone, it will become a forest of some kind. And really the forests that we walk through here in Connecticut, where I am, and all forests are dynamic, they're not static, they're always going through cycles of succession, of disturbance and growth over time. And in New England, you know, a few hundred years ago, about 70 to 80% of the land area was cleared for agriculture and primarily pasture land. And so a lot of the forests that we've seen grow in is either first successional or second successional forests. So first we have species that are really well adapted to growing in conditions that have been cleared for farm or pasture or whatever other kind of disturbance it's been. You have your white pine, you have your birch, your red cedar, and then over time there are more shade tolerant trees that will grow up under that canopy and eventually you know, grow into the full canopy, into the primary canopy. And so there's this, you know, these dynamic changes that happen over time. And this was something that, you know, our host in the film, Hugh, was talking a lot about, how the gorse, which is not a plant that I'm familiar with, but essentially is an invasive shrub that really creates this impenetrable layer, this vegetation layer in the pasture land in New Zealand. You know, most of the time people spend all this energy trying to eradicate it by burning it or poisoning it or what have you, but he's actually working with the natural processes, the sort of shelter that the gorse provides to the shade tolerant native trees that have this sort of happy environment, if you will, a shady, moist, nitrogen rich environment to grow as seedlings and eventually to penetrate the canopy of the gorse, which is not shade tolerant and will die if it doesn't have enough sunlight. So this process of forest succession was something that Hugh worked with. You know, he didn't have a heavy hand. He worked with this natural process to let the forest regrow. So, and, you know, these same processes of forest succession work in forests all over the world, but of course they're different according to the different species that we have, you know, here in Connecticut versus New Zealand.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that, Caro.
A little long-winded, but
no, it's perfect. We're level setting. That was wonderful. And it leads perfectly into something else that we had spoken about a little bit yesterday. Louise, you had mentioned that you know the film was sort of aptly named in your opinion, right? Fools and Dreamers. And you know, in my mind, the type of fools and dreamers that Hugh is, right, is the type that we need more of. The people who not only have dreams, but actually act on them and are willing to actually do something about it. We need that in so many ways, in so many aspects of our life right now, in our society. But in what ways is this story that we watched exceptional, even maybe to the point of being a little bit misleading? Or like, were there things, elements in the film that that were sort of overly hopeful in terms of our chances of doing something like that here?
Well, nothing spurs me into action than someone calling me a fool or a dreamer. So that helped me to create my major in college. I was told I'd never be a biology major. I was never going to be able to save the last forest in Stony Brook, Long Island. there's a lot of things people have challenged me with, and it just gets me going. So I don't mind being called a fool or a dreamer. And I think in that way, the film was aptly named. But I think one of the things that I had several reactions to the film. First of all, it's a great story. Second of all, I've always wanted to visit New Zealand. So there are those. I did notice things along the way that I thought would be helpful clarifications to those fools and dreamers on the other side of the world amongst ourselves who want to help native forests come back. Aside from the obvious restrictions we have by having paved over a great deal of the Northeast, we do certainly have patches of land, and sometimes larger patches of land, that could be subject to regeneration and restoration. And you have to kind of know where you're starting from and where you want to go. Because as long as we're involving ourselves in restoration or manipulation of the landscape, it's a really good thing to understand what our goals are, what we want at the other end. Because if we sit back and allow simple regeneration, at this point where we are in the Northeast, we will get lots of invasive species, and we will get a lot of generation of a forest type that may not be what we're looking for. For instance, we may get an impenetrable grove of Norway maples, trees from Europe that don't play nicely with our landscape or other plants or our wildlife. So when we undertake things like this, we end up doing things like weeding. We want to know what the seed bank is that's in the soil and nearby, what kinds of things are going to blow in on a breeze, and what has the land been used for before. Now in New Zealand, where there's sheep everywhere, which are known to have a tremendous impact on soil because they put perhaps more poundage per square foot into each hoof print than most other animals. I mean, lots of hoofed animals do that, but sheep are particularly known for it. And when you have compacted soil, you lose your top layer, which is typically the organic layer, very quickly. Water runs off instead of seeping through, and you get erosion, and you have a hard time growing things. In the case of New Zealand, they were lucky that, in a way, that a plant like gorse came along, which can grow in those kinds of soils. It's an invasive in New Zealand, it came from Europe also, but it can send down roots, and the water can travel along those roots and get into the ground instead of running off the ground and taking even more topsoil with it. So that was an advantage they had. We have to look at what our land has been used for previously to kind of guess at what's in the seed bank. So what are the characteristics of the soil right there that can help regenerate a forest? And do we want to boost that with restoration, which is really the involvement of people?
Yeah.
Well, restoration is what people desire and people do. And regeneration is nature taking its course with what's available and the processes that are naturally occurring based on what's available, in simple terms. So I really think it's important that we have a goal. And it wasn't real clear in the film that the overall goal was more specific than bringing trees back, unless I missed it. The aerial views of trees having come back into the landscape were very exciting, but what concerned me is when we went under the canopy, this is in the film, we went under the canopy and we saw the leftover gorse that had died. The structure that was left creates a habitat or a non-habitat that is not normal in a forest. Those twisted, bare architectural structure of leftover gorse is not necessarily optimal. And since gorse is not something that evolved in New Zealand, it's possible it could take a very long time to decompose. There may not be the right bacteria and fungi there to attack gorse and allow it to fall down and turn into peat or humus or some kind of soil component. So what you see on the surface isn't necessarily what you want in the end. And the last thing I'll say on that, and then I'll jump off, is there's the element of time. It takes a long time for a forest to develop, and it's not just trees. A great deal of the most important life in a forest is underground. We can't see it, and it's the network and communication between shrubs and trees, fungi, soil, water resources, and we don't know anything about that in the New Zealand example. But we did see a lot of trees grow up in a 10-year period, so that is hopeful.
Yeah, that's great. And that's it's helpful to have that additional perspective. So thank you, Louise, because I think we want to be hopeful and we want to go out, especially, you know, speaking from the perspective of someone who's on the ecological restoration team for Save the Sound, you know, restoration is something we really believe in, but also it helps to come to that with clear eyes about what you're able to do and then what nature is going to have to sort of carry the rest of the way. And I know Hugh in the film talks about it's really just removing the deleterious things that are keeping nature from coming back or from regenerating. So it's helpful to have that perspective as well. And one of the things you spoke about a lot too is the goals. What are the goals? And so here I want to bring in Alicia to sort of ground this in the Long Island Sound region for us, right? So this whole project at Hinewai started as conservation, right? It was, we're going to take these, I think it was originally 270 acres or 109 hectares. And we're going to put that into conservation, and we're going to then start to explore regeneration on it. That was sort of the stated goal there, right? Was there's this barren land that was farmed and then deserted. Can we bring this back? Let's see if we can bring this back and regenerate native forest. And one of the things that kept being said was, you know, one of the reasons they were able to do that and that others were now following their example is because that land was considered uneconomical. So through the lens of conservation and your experience here in Connecticut and in the Long Island Sound region, how does that look different? How does conservation look different? What are the goals? Is there such a thing as uneconomical land here? And you know, if so, what might that look like? If not, how do we justify conservation? And what are the strongest arguments for it here?
Sure. Well, I think I'm talking to a number of people who live here and know that it's very different from those beautiful scenes that we saw in New Zealand. And I share the desire of Louise to go to New Zealand sometime. But, you know, so in our world here in this region of America, you know, we have very little left. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here. All our land is, you know, largely developed in many areas. Land here, as you know, is valued in it's a different way from what we saw in the film. The farmers there were talking about they were trying to farm land that was, you know, less productive and less economical. And, you know, so having this type of regeneration was helpful to them. Here, all of our land values are based on the highest and best use, which in our society is building housing units or stores or industry. It's what you can build on it. And that's how our land use has been developed over the years. And especially, especially here in southern New England and the New York metropolitan area. So we need to, conserve what is left of value. And the value in open space and forests and land that hasn't already been developed in recent years is, I look at that value in a number of different ways. One is for the wildlife corridors and biodiversity that Hugh talked about in New Zealand. We do in this country preserve land for those purposes. And those corridors are essential. And the corridors can be by air, certainly the migratory flyway that includes Plum Island and many of the places in Connecticut where our migratory birds are coming from the north to Mexico and South America every year is critical, as a critical corridor. So anything we can do to help with that corridor and other wildlife corridors is really critical, because we have very little chance to do so. So there are the values of open space land for wildlife purposes. There is value for our communities. I like to, I espouse the principle of, we need to preserve land because it's good for our overall community. It's good for humans, it's good for wildlife. Us humans, we need places to gather in our communities. And sometimes open space and parks in cities can add to our communities and our society in a way that so many other places cannot. And if we don't look at our whole community and the benefit of protecting land for our whole community, for the interaction of wildlife and the value of biodiversity and the value to humans to commingle together and get away from each other during COVID-19 and go for walks and be able to take in the silence or the birds, we have to look at that as a total value, not just the value of the highest and best use and how you can develop it.
Yeah, 100%. And the other thing that I think about, and that Hugh touched on as part of the solution, the way that preserving or regenerating trees in this kind of forest space is important. Also, as we think about resilience in the face of climate change, right? And trees as carbon sequestration and carbon sinks, but that is also incomplete as a solution. He said, we can reforest every dry inch of land that we have, but if we keep using fossil fuels, it's not gonna get us there. So I want to go back to Caro, but I also want to just remind folks that your voice is welcome, and we'd love to have you in the conversation. So if you'd like to ask a question, you can post it in the chat, or you can go to the participants panel and raise your hand. I will see you and I will bring you into the conversation. But to Caro, because I could go all day with this, to Caro, the value of trees and forestry and the practice of it looks a lot different in urban environments and in more developed environments. And to Alicia's point, that's most of what we have here in New England, or at least we have a wealth of that. We have a wealth of developed areas. So in your work as an urban forester, right, how does what you do relate to what Hugh's doing, if it does? And how do you think about the benefit of trees and the relationship of our developed areas to forest and to sort of the natural?
Yeah, great question. Well, you know, here in the city, I definitely think about trees as critical infrastructure, you know, and when we think about them in that way and all of the important ecosystem services and benefits that they provide, whether they be the psycho-spiritual, you know, like supporting our mental health and our community's ability to gather and unwind and take care of ourselves, or whether it's stormwater management, pollution mitigation, carbon capture and storage, sure. But I think that all of these other things that sort of fall into more of a climate change adaptation bucket, how we're able to cope with the changes in our climate, you know, I think that trees play a really critical role in that for our communities, whether it's mitigating the effects of urban heat island. So cities and urban areas are generally multiple degrees warmer than their peri-urban and rural counterparts because of all of the, you know, absorption of thermal energy and the asphalt and other impervious surfaces. And it's really important. It's a matter of life or death that we have trees around to shade our neighborhoods, our buildings, and to keep people cool and healthy. And so, you know, that's just one of the examples of the ways in which trees in our cities and our neighborhoods are really important. And when we think about the goals of why we plant them and why we manage them and keep them healthy and invest in them, those are some of the things that an urban forester is thinking about. You know, and they support a local green jobs economy. You know, here we're planting trees in New Haven, in Northwest or Northeast Connecticut. You know, trees are also supporting livelihoods, a thriving, you know, forest product industry that, you know, kind of incentivizes people to hold on to forest land, right, and preserve trees because there's value in managing the forest. You know, that is also important too. It's just supporting livelihoods in different ways, yeah, in the city and in the rural areas. So I fear I've veered a little bit off track now.
No. You're just fine. That was great because it's interesting. You know, I grew up in a very rural area personally, and when I moved to the city, I live in New Haven now, and the trees are one of the things that give me such great comfort. And, you know, there's a recognition too. You can go to the top of East Rock Park here in New Haven and you can look out over the city. And in the springtime like this or the summertime, the tree cover is really quite remarkable in the areas that you can see very clearly from the top of East Rock Park. But there's also, you know, there's a layer to this which is tied very, very closely to environmental justice and to you know, sort of recognizing that often lower income communities have lower tree cover or less tree cover. And I know that that's something with URI that you all are working on addressing fairly directly. Do you want to speak to that?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and what you've noticed anecdotally, you know, just by whether it's, you know, driving or walking through different neighborhoods or checking out a bird's eye view from the top of East Rock, we've been able to, you know, through various studies, whether they be our street tree inventory, where we keep track of every tree that's planted within the public right of way, or an urban tree canopy assessment, where we look at the bird's eye view, you know, forest coverage of the landmass across the city. It's very clear that the trees are not distributed evenly throughout the city, whether that's, you know, on public land as street trees or even on private and park land too. So we're very deliberate about trying to make sure that we're doing more outreach and as much tree planting as we can in neighborhoods that have lower tree canopy cover, are lower income, are generally more vulnerable to things like air pollution, urban heat island effect. And so we definitely see that as part of our mission and our mandate to reverse many of those trends of environmental injustice due to unequal distribution of trees. And actually, one of a former intern with URI and a graduate of the Yale School of Forestry, he just published a report about the connection between neighborhoods that were redlined through unfair, racist home loan programs, and the connection between those neighborhoods that were redlined and the current tree canopy cover today that, you know, across the board, across dozens of cities, you know, across the United States, those neighborhoods that were denied loans also have much lower tree canopy cover. So we're trying to reverse decades and decades of disinvestment through our programs. And it's only one small part, of course, but yeah, it's definitely part of our mission.
It's important though. So thank you for giving us a look at that.
Yeah.
Catherine Watson, I see that you have your hand up. So I'm going to take you off mute here.
Thanks. And it's Watso.
Oh, sorry.
No worries, no worries. Everybody does that. Thank you for taking my hand. And I see there are a lot of well-educated individuals here, and I am just in the learning phase of things regarding the management of forests. I've always had a love of it. And from the movie, when I watched it yesterday evening, Hugh brought up financial aspects of carbon sequestration and the importance for climate change. Didn't have time to research New Zealand's approach to this. Would love us to have conversations with foresters and other people and water production and other places, not only from the standpoint of what it is for every human person that would benefit from forestry, clean water, the whole bit. How can we support changing our mindset of looking at timber as cordwood, board, square foot board. I forget the term I was looking up the other day. DB is it, I think. Anyway, instead of measuring the value of trees based on their production value for the L word, logging and removing trees, because I'm not here to say logging is the bad thing at all. But I think we need to look at ways to do it in such a way that we don't have to take down so many species. I'm rambling at the moment and I apologize for that, but going back to the movie, is there a way in Connecticut that we can look at financially embedding in climate sequestration, say, save these trees, save these forests, we'll pay you to do that because of the long-term value of that instead of cutting them down as we work on reducing our use of these products in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
And I'll mute myself. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Catherine. That's a great question, and it also kind of dovetails with a couple of the things that have come through on chat from Aaron. Aaron, I'll admit that I don't know what pelagic waters are, but you know, this idea that there's conditions to the ability of trees to sequester carbon. I know that's actually something that I've learned from Caro over the years, that not all trees are created equal when it comes to sequestration. But to your question, Catherine, I'll add a little piece to it and then I'll throw it to the panel. There's also, you know, other benefits that we've touched on a little bit here to forests and healthy forests in terms of filtering drinking water, providing more ecosystem services, and then also providing open space. So while it's always a difficult conversation, I think maybe like Louise, you have some experience, or Alicia, if you want to talk about this, but I know our organization deals with this a bit in terms of the value of land and these spaces, and how do we properly assess that, and are there pathways for us to make conservation more of the financially sound decision?
Yes, if we all get on it. And again, we have to know the goals. So whereas Catherine, we certainly need to give more credit to trees for their ecosystem services than Most people do, and not just look at them as board feet of lumber. But we also do need board feet of lumber to be produced. So it comes down to management in that aspect of where are we going to be growing trees for wood, and where are we going to try to protect forests for their other ecosystem services. And there are economists who are looking at the trying to put valuations on different ecosystem services. It's a whole field of inquiry now to see what a forest would be worth. What is an individual tree worth? What is a watershed worth in dollars, because of the way our economy is set up and money talks. So that's not my particular field, but if you are interested in that, you can look up ecological valuation and try to get into that sort of, try Googling that and see what people are doing about that. With regard to affecting change, I know that Martin Luther King Jr. Had said that first you start with protests and it moves into policy, and then into programs, and then into progress. I mentioned this forest in Stony Brook. We had exactly that issue that you brought up. It was 37 acres that were going to be turned into 40 houses on steep terrain that would have unleashed a host of environmental disasters on the neighborhood. We started with protests, and fortunately there were some policy and programs already in place that we could take advantage of, but we started with protests in that particular situation, and we moved on, and we were successful in that.
Louise, can I jump
Sure.
in?
You need to direct me. Okay.
We're running a little low on time, and I see Alicia
Okay.
wants to jump in. So Alicia,
Good.
do you want to add here?
I'll just jump in quickly. I don't have too much to add on the carbon sequestration value. I do know that people are studying it. It's just not my expertise, but at the Trust for Public Land, there were some efforts going on with that. And it's usually in relation to much larger pieces, very large pieces of land. But in Connecticut, I just want to mention, Laura and Melissa pointed out that the Public Act 490 helps us to conserve farms, forests, and open space by reducing the taxes on those for acreages 10 or 25 acres and above. So there are some ways that land can be conserved and reserved for all of these things already in place, but we definitely need more. And I just wanted to mention that another segment that we're not talking about today, because we don't have time, is agriculture. And there are, one of our board members is Dina Brewster, who owns the Hickories, an organic farm in Ridgefield. And she gave us a wonderful tour, really showing us the regenerative agriculture that she's doing there in an organic way to use the land and cultivate that soil in ways that will allow it to do that on its own. And it's a wonderful practice that a lot of farmers are doing. So it's a nice relation to what he was doing in New Zealand, and because that is happening here, and we should be supportive of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a really phenomenal tour. I loved that up at the Hickories. And thank you to Melissa for putting some stuff in chat for us. The PA 490 program has temporarily preserved 269,000 acres of farmland, nearly 500,000 acres of forest, and 1,000 acres of open space. So that kind of policy approach can have a real impact. It is 12:45. So for those of you who have to jump right now, I have to leave us, want to say thank you very much for joining us. I do want to keep us going for those who can stay for a little bit longer, because I know that Starling had a question, and I also really want to wrap this all up with our panelists. So if you have to leave, thank you very much for coming. And the rest of this will be posted. If you can stay with us, stay with us. All right, Starling, you had a question. So I'll take you off mute here.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Thank you, all the panelists, Alicia, Caro, and Louise. This is excellent. Yeah, no, not so much question, maybe just was going to try and backfill some of the concerns about, you know, active forest management and land preservation. It's pretty clear. We have on the Great Mountain Forest up here, it's my grandfather preserved, you know, literally thousands of acres. My father managed it, graduate forestry school. I'm overseeing it. It's all in conservation now, 7,000 acres roughly of formerly completely clear cut, completely cut over scrub, which so the film was very apropos what happened here, which was they basically just stood back and let the New England forest, as Caro so well described, come back on its own. And then gradually reestablish ways to get into the forest and begin to manage for the better trees and all the things that a forest provides. We've proceeded to sell the carbon credits that we offset, which was about a $4 million project with the California Carbon Registry. It's interesting to note, if you go to the Yale Environment 360 online magazine, they just did an article about Jeff Bezos' $100 million commitment to sequestering forest carbon on small acreage forests. Very interesting little article. But the key is that it's not a static situation, as Caro so well described. Forests are dynamic, they're always changing, and we're a part of that system. You won't find any of your water companies that maintain filtration forests around all the reservoirs just standing back and letting the forest be. They're actively managing those forests. They're replacing the loss of red pine, which was a leaf filter, with other species of evergreens. And then it's this new phase to save, you know, most of Connecticut's grown back beautifully from a period of almost complete deforestation to the point where now we need young forests to create habitat for some of the birds that Alicia so well mentioned. That require those early successional forests that we're losing, and even open land for the New England cottontail. So all of those, that basket of ecosystem services requires an active management role, really. Where there is old growth, which in Connecticut is very little, and we have a little bit of it here, you know, pre-colonial forest, that deserves to be saved too. And we would like to push more of our forests towards a more mature stage, and in doing carbon credits, you effectively kind of do that. So I just wanted to jump in. Caro said I should talk about New Zealand and my time in the gorse. You stay out of gorse. You do not walk in gorse. It's horrible. I worked for the New Zealand Forest Service and in some catchments, but most of that was native bush. But I know the Banks Peninsula, and the problem there was it's a stratovolcano, and the soils are very poor. They cleared the forest and then found that nothing really grew very well except for gorse, because they're very they don't have a lot of potassium in their soils. They actually bomb potassium in forests that they plant in New Zealand, so, or potash. So it's a big problem because most of New Zealand is sort of a young, poorly developed soils, unlike what we have here, which is a rich glacial mix. Anyhow, that's a long-winded saying, but thank you for letting me jump in. I actually have to jump off and join the my recertification for Public Act 490 for foresters.
That's great.
Good segue that Alicia mentioned Public Act 490, because foresters have to prepare reports for 25 acres or more and generally make recommendations on what you might do to manage your forest. But I think the urban forest is so critical. The upper watershed forests are just as valuable as certainly the last gasp when you get to the sound. And Louise, you're in an interesting area. I'd love to talk about that effort in Stony Brook. And my great grandfather lived in Locust Valley and left a large forest, or the family left a large piece of his estate there. as it's called the Coffin Woods. I don't know if you know it out in Locust Valley, but you should go walk the Coffin Woods. That was my great grandfather's property.
That's good to know. I do know the property.
Yeah, it could have been hundreds of houses, but it got left for all time as a woods. Needs a lot of invasive management. That's one thing I do in restoration work in southern Connecticut. Do a lot of that, but that's another whole story.
Well,
but thank you so much.
Thanks for filling us in on all of your activities. That's very inspiring.
No,
Long Island saved the Pine Barrens. It's approximately 100,000 acres in central Long Island, starting around 30 years ago. And we finally have bought up all the properties that need to be preserved in the core area, and the compatible growth areas being closely watched over. And that protects drinking water supply in our deep recharge aquifer. So that's the largest overall forest protection activity on Long Island that managed to save a large tract all at once. A lot of Long Island's forests are fragmented, but they all contribute to water quality, whether it's in our aquifers for drinking water or in our coastal waters. So it's a very important ecosystem function on Long Island, as well as for wildlife. I didn't mean to cut you off, Starling. I think you had one more thing you wanted to say.
No, I think that's fantastic. I know the deep recharge. I think the greatest example that's still sort of touted was when the New York Water Department was able to convince the EPA to do more forest easements and not have to build water filtration plants that cost billions of dollars to use easements. They went up into their surrounding areas around the reservoirs and the Catskills and bought forest land easements from the people, which put money up into the otherwise depressed upstate communities, and also accomplished the goal of protecting forests, but not taking it out of management. So those forests are still managed sometimes. So the landowners own the land, but they can't convert it. And that's a great example of the water connection in watersheds. So it's the oft quoted a great example nature system. Thank you guys. This is great. Thanks, Anthony. Thanks, Corinna, for organizing this. And
yeah, thank you for joining us, and thank you for offering that extremely pertinent and relevant experience. That's really
I was so into that film. I can't tell you. I was working in native bush in the South Island that was slated to be converted to fast-growing pine, and they changed it. Now all that area is protected forest forever. You can't even cut a native tree in New Zealand anymore.
Yeah,
that's how valuable they are. Yeah, it's a fantastic story.
Yeah. There's Hugh is one of my new personal heroes. So thank you to everyone. I think, thank you, Starling, for joining us. Go get that PA 490 set up. And I want to, before we close, I want to quickly just run back through our panelists and just have each of you, maybe we'll start with Alicia and go through two things really quickly. The first is what gives you hope from this conversation and on this topic? And the second is what's one thing that we can do as stewards and as managers of our own land, wherever we are?
So actually, I think the things that we can do individually give me hope. So they're combined. And I loved how they closed out the movie and talked about, I'm never going to have 1,900 hectare of anything. I'm never going to be able to do that. But what can I do? Riding bikes and walking instead of using your motor vehicles, the things that we all try to do anyway. And also planting pollinator plants. I just love that. The ability for any of us to just plant a flower and do something good for the world. It gives me hope.
Yeah. Well done, sort of answering both at once. That was that was great. Caro.
Awesome. Well, sticking to the film, I think one thing that was so hopeful to me about Hugh and their project was just seeing someone so deeply committed to his values and seeing someone live out a life that was just unwavering. Not using vehicles, walking to work, riding his bike, and just the sheer commitment. And that's something that I certainly aspire to. And it's seeing people live in that way that gives me hope, no matter what it is that they're deeply committed to. And something that we can do, again, going back to Hugh in the film, we didn't talk necessarily about his deep knowledge of the land that he was living on, the decades that he spent learning about the native plants and their natural histories and how they interact with one another. I think that that's something that we can all do no matter where we live, is to really develop deep relationship with the plants around us and also the history of our land, who's inhabited it and how it's been managed over time. And all of those things will lead us to take more meaningful action going forward. So thanks.
That's such a great answer. A call to get to know our place and the history of our place and let that inform sort of our deepening relationship with the land that we're on. The land, like here in New Haven where I sit, this is Quinnipiac land, and sort of understanding the history of that and the species that thrive and are native. And yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Louise, last word.
On top of the hope that's given me by the number of participants today in this webinar and your great questions and your interest in this, and the supporters of Save the Sound and Caro's supporters in her work, nature's regenerative powers in and of themselves are my source of hope every day. And I think it's worth noting that we can see that nature has a memory when we stand back and we let some things take their course. We'll see a recent memory if we see regeneration of landscaping plants or invasive plants that we've brought here. We'll see its deeper memory when a native forest can return because of a seed bank. I'm very fortunate to live on a parcel that's surrounded by native forest. And when we stopped picking up the leaves 5 years ago, it was a tough call for me with my partner who likes to get rid of the leaves. I found that within a year and a half, 2 years, I had native plants popping up. And I know that was an interaction between the insects that were eating up those leaves, the birds eating those insects, the birds visiting the yard, the seeds that were being planted, but also the memory in the soil. And I got for free 17 eastern red cedars, 3 bayberry bushes, and a whole bunch of low bush blueberries, as well as a lot of wildflowers. So I didn't have to do anything. I did less and I got more. But it does depend on what you're surrounded by and keeping a close eye on things. And I am blessed to have a botany in my background so I can recognize the invaders when they come in. But anyway, this whole discussion gives me hope. And thanks for the opportunity to participate in it.
Yeah, we're honored to have you join for this conversation. You brought so much to it, as did all of you. And so I just want to thank everyone who joined us today. This was the 5th edition of this environmental film club, and the response has been really wonderful, and we love having you share this space with us. So we hope you'll keep coming back to these. We're doing the next one, I believe, is going to be on July 1st, and then July 15th after that. So every other Wednesday. And we really just appreciate this time with all of you and the ability to have these conversations about such interesting and provocative and important topics. So we hope you'll continue to join us. We hope if you have capacity, you can help us out and support our work at www.savethesound.org/donate. We're very appreciative of everything and anything that you can do. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next one.